Hello everyone and welcome to another middle game episode focusing on the pawn structure with Coach B and masteryourchess.com. This is the third video on weak squares, and in this video we're going to take a look at the minority attack, which also is another strategy that will help you create weak squares in the enemy camp. A minority attack is generally an attack by two pawns against three pawns with the idea of forcing a weakness. The result of the minority attack will be either two weak pawns that can easily be targeted, or a backward pawn that will also create a hole in the enemy camp that can be used by your pieces to become more active. In this first example, white can start the minority attack on the queen side where he has two pawns versus black's three pawns. To start the minority attack, it's always good to back it up with the rook before you do that. So here, white would want to move rook to b1. After this, let's say black will respond with something like rook to e8. And now, white will start the minority attack with b4. If black moves something, let's say like rook to e4, well here, white will push the pawn to b5, hitting black's pawn chain. And now, if black takes the pawn, let's say c takes b5, after white captures the pawn on b5, he is hitting two pawns at the same time, the pawn on d5 and the pawn on b7. Therefore, white will be able to go up a pawn. After something like rook to e7, white will simply capture the other pawn. Coming back, if black here moves the pawn to a6, trying to prevent the pawn moving to b5, well, white can respond with pawn to a4. And if black makes the same move, let's say rook to e4, then white can continue the minority attack with b5, and after a takes b5, a takes b5, c takes b5, and rook takes b5, we have the same situation where white attacks two pawns at the same time, and he is going to be able to win one of them. Now let's go back and let's see what happens if here black stops the minority attack. Let's say that here he's going to move the pawn to b5. Now black stopped the minority attack, however you could see that this creates a hole on c5 and also a backward pawn on c6. Definitely white can simply start attacking it, and black will have to constantly defend that backward pawn. Now, especially if there would be minors on this board, the hole on c5 would be an excellent square for a knight or another minor in the enemy camp, gaining huge advantages. Coming back, I also want to mention that black can start his own minority attack on the king side. Moving the pawn to f5 and then to f4, here black would be the one creating a minority attack as well. Usually, the most satisfactory way to cope with the minority attack is to develop threats that keep your opponent busy elsewhere. Just trying to defend against the minority attack will encourage it and it will probably enable it to succeed. Passive defense usually leads to positional bankruptcy. The best alternative is to combine defense and counterattack, protecting and attacking simultaneously. So let me show you one of those type of examples. In this next position, it's black to move, and we could see here that white started the minority attack on the queen side. However, due to the poor position of white's queen, black here has a powerful counterattack. So here, black moves the knight to h4, and after this, white responds with rook f to e1, and now bishop to h3. If here white responds with g3, well, knight to f3 is a beautiful fork, forking the king, rook, and queen. And coming back, if white responds with g takes h3, well, the same situation happens, where the king, rook, and queen are forked. And coming back, the other option would be something like bishop to f1, protecting the pawn on g2. However, here black can simply sacrifice his bishop. After bishop takes g2, bishop takes g2 and queen to g4, there's not much that white can do here to save his game. If he's trying to run away with the king, well, after queen takes g2, king to e2, knight to f3, queen to d1, knight takes e1, black is totally winning. And coming back, another try would be moving the pawn to f3, where the queen guards the bishop. However, this is even worse because after knight takes f3, the king, rook, and queen are forked again, as the bishop is pinned and it cannot capture the knight. So after something like king h1 and knight takes d2, white can resign. So as we saw in this game, even though the minority attack is a very great strategy, you just want to make sure that you still keep an eye on your king for potential threats. The minority attack is very common in many types of openings, especially in the Queen's Gambit opening and also the Caro-Kann defense. So let's go over two of those examples from my student database where the minority attack took place. So this example is coming from the Queen's Gambit, and I'm just going to fast forward through the critical moves. And you could see here, white started the minority attack and black is trying to prevent it. However, after a4, the minority attack continues. Here, black responded with bishop to d7, and then white responded with b5. After a takes b5 and a takes b5, in this game, knight to g6 was played. Coming back, I do want to mention that if black here would have responded with c takes on b5, after bishop takes b5, bishop takes b5, rook takes b5, now both the pawn on d5 and the pawn on b7 are targeted. And here, since white is doubled up on the pawn on d5, he will be able to win it as that pawn is not protected. If black brings a defender, he's still going to be able to capture it as he's attacking it twice. So coming back in the game, black responded with knight to g6, from which white responded with b takes c6. Black took on c6, and now you could see that black has a backward pawn on c6, and also a hole was created on c5. From here, white responded with knight to a4, as the knight is protected by the queen. Rook e to b8. Bishop takes e4, removing the defender of the hole on c5. D takes e4, knight to d2. And here, black is totally over. The pawn on e4 is targeted by the queen and the knight on d2, and that's going to be captured pretty soon. And also a hole on c5 is created, which will be an excellent square for white's knight. So here, black is totally lost. In the game, black responded with c5 and white just captured it, and from here he just went on winning the game. The pawn on e4, now it's targeted 3 times, there's no way to hold on to it, and white being up 2 pawns in an excellent pawn structure, white had an easy game and went on winning. And this last game I'm going to go over is a game that was played with the Caro-Kann defense. So again, I'm going to fast forward and stop to comment on the critical moves. And here, as white's pawns are pointing towards the king side, that's the area where white should concentrate his forces and attack, while black's pawns point towards the other side. He would first finish his kingside development with knight to f6, bishop e7, castling, and then start the minority attack, backing it up with rook to b8 and then b7 to b5. So let's continue in this game. Here, white responded with castle, knight to f6, bishop to g5, bishop to e7, blocking the pin. Knight b to d2, castle, bishop takes f6, bishop takes f6, rook f to e1, rook to b8, knight to b3, and now b5. Here, black starts the minority attack right away. In the game, white responded with knight to c5, pawn to b4, c takes b4, rook takes b4, and now the pawn on d4 is targeted by the knight on c6, bishop on f6, and the rook on b6. It's only being defended twice by the knight on f3 and the queen on d3. Also, black targets the pawn on b2. If here, white simply protects the pawn on b1, well, the knight can take on b4, winning a central pawn, and black has a much better position. Coming back, another response could be rook a to d1, protecting the pawn on d4 in the center. However, here, black can simply take again. White responds with something like b3. Then the queen can come to d6, attacking the knight on c5 that's not protected now. a3, knight takes f3 check, queen takes f3, rook b to b8, backing it down. And here, black is up a pawn with a very dangerous central control. Coming back, if instead of moving the pawn to b3 here, white will respond with knight takes d4. Well, here, black can even take with the rook, attacking the queen, as obviously white will not give up the queen for the rook, as the bishop could take back. But here, black can even take with the bishop. After bishop takes d4, let's say a3, attacking the rook, rook to c4 and b3, trying to chase away the rook. Well, here black can simply sacrifice the bishop for another pawn, taking on f2, weakening the king, and then simply winning the knight that's not protected. And here black is totally winning again. And coming back, I do want to mention that here, if white will not take the pawn on b4, let's say he would move something like rook a to d1. After black takes on c3 and white takes back, now white has a backward pawn on c3, and also it creates a hole on c4. And now black can take advantage of that hole right away with knight to a5, then jumping on c4, or he can use that square later on. Black also has an open b file, and here black is in very good shape. Alright, thank you so much for watching this video, and stay tuned for more lessons. The next lesson we're going to take a look at 2 master games that were played, and we're going to take a look to see how they created weak squares and took advantage of them. If you liked my video, please subscribe and don't forget to check out my new website, masteryourchess.com, where you can learn, practice, test, and master your chess knowledge.